Welcome, everybody, to Globally Connected at FIT. This is our virtual series. We've been going for the past 2 years now, which welcomes students, faculty, staff, alumni, friends around the world to come together and to speak about issues, facing us that are today, that are happening today. Our major themes are fashion and art, sustainability, racial equity, and life during the pandemic. But of course, anything and everything global is also part of our subject matters. And that's why we welcome people from all over the world with all of their very diverse perspectives. So today, we'll be we will be delighted to welcome Eva Haug from the Netherlands, and along with Nurhayat Bilge. She's from FIT. They're going to introduce themselves, and the title of this presentation is called Professional Interactions in a Global World. So thank you very much for joining us. I'll turn it over to Nurhayat.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nurhayat Bilge, and I'm an assistant professor at FIT in the English and Communication Studies department. This is my third year at FIT, most of which unfortunately went through COVID, but I'm very happy to be here. My area of specialty is intercultural communication and conflict management. I also teach public speaking, so those are my specialties. I'm gonna turn it over to Eva to introduce herself.
Thank you. So I'm Eva Haug in Dutch, but Haug is fine. I'm located in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. I had the pleasure of meeting Helen and Nurhayat in person when I visited FIT in 2019, pre-pandemic. When I spent my sabbatical in New York State visiting different universities. I work at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. I teach intercultural competence, and I'm an educational advisor for Curriculum Internationalization.
So what we want to do is start off by talking about defining certain concepts, such as what exactly is, what do we mean by international, what do we mean by intercultural, and then get into certain consequences or possible end results of cross-cultural integration, cross-cultural workspaces. And I will be offering certain ideas, certain examples from perspective of being the foreigner in a different cultural context. And then I will turn it over to Eva, and she will take it from there. So, I do want to start, and for many of you, this will be either preaching to the choir, I get it, or those of you who have been in my classroom, this will be a repeat. So I do want to define what culture is before I define the nationality aspect of it, because a lot of the times we do focus on simply nationality in terms of when we think about cultures. What is a different culture? Oh, it's a different country, it's a different place. Someone recently, I heard them define it as, and it gave me a huge kick. Most people think culture is something cute that other people have. I don't have a culture, I'm normal, something cute that other people have. Cute dresses, cute food, or cute artifacts. When in reality, culture is, and this part I learned from Eva herself, think about culture as the wind. Am I correct? It's the unseen, it's the untouchable, intangible, it's the norms, beliefs, values that govern our lives. So everything that we do and the way we do it, that's culture. When you put it in those terms, it's not only nationalities, but from different ethnicities, different religious groups, different genders, sexuality, religions, to even organizations themselves have different cultures. So even moving from one organization to the other within the same nationality, within the same national context, you are changing cultural contexts. And when you look at it that way, and when you look at culture as the way we see the world, the way we do things, what we think is appropriate, polite, this is how things are done. Then you realize that from one context to the other, when you make that move, everything can switch, everything can change. And when we define culture in that sense, then defining movement, being transcultural, being intercultural from one context to the other, you can kind of see that so many different details may be different. Because think about it, in terms of, okay, nationality, laws are things that are written. Norms are the unwritten rules, which means no one writes this down. No one tells you this is how things are. You learn how things are done. And if they're really, really different than what you're used to, that's when you start getting into a little bit of a conflict. So when two different cultural norms come together, when you get into a different cultural setting and you realize certain things, maybe little details, maybe on a larger context, rules change on you, norms change on you, what's considered the way we do things change on you. There are three possible results. One is assimilation. And when you think about, for instance, immigrants from one country to the other, that's a word that's thrown around a lot. Do people assimilate? Is that the goal that we ask for? Do we want people to assimilate? Assimilation requires someone to fit into the new cultural context, not just adapt to it, but basically internalize all the norms, all the values, all the beliefs of that cultural context. So basically becoming one of the host culture. The other end of the spectrum for that, another result that may come out of intercultural or cross-cultural transitioning is alienation. What is alienation? You get into a new context, everything is foreign, everything is different, and you know your norms, you know your values, your way of seeing the world, understanding it, or your way of doing things, and you look at it as, okay, my way is the right way, and this is completely wrong, and I don't want to lose my way, my values, so you alienate yourself. Or sometimes you are perceived as incredibly different, so you are forced to alienate, you are pushed to the margins, and the group itself alienates you. Now, these are both very problematic end results. The happy medium, I like to call, is acculturation, right there in the middle. Acculturation is when you get into a new cultural setting, you keep some of the norms and values that you internalized. You adapt to the new norms, new values that you are learning, that you are observing, and you mix and match. And intercultural competence comes from knowing when to operate with which norms. Meaning, if you go back to your home culture, then you know what the norms are and you can adapt to those norms. When you're in the host culture, you can do the exact same thing. Finding that happy medium. You don't lose who you are, but you add on, you enrich who you are by learning new norms, learning new values. Now, I did say enrich because that's the beauty of any kind of an intercultural interaction. Why do we need, for instance, diversity? This is a word that we've been hearing a lot about. It's been thrown around. Everywhere you go, we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. We're actually using that as a goal for many of the organizations, for at least in the US, almost as the end goal for all of us, anywhere in any organization, in any aspect of the society. So what do we mean by that? Why do we even need it? Well, the diversity part is different people coming together. That's great. Why do we need that? Because if we can actually include everyone into different aspects of either an organization or a nationality, what happens is we enrich everyone's lives. So it's not just the new person that's coming in that's learning something, but the cultural context, people who are used to certain norms, certain values, ways of doing things. All of a sudden, their lives are also enriched because they now have someone who has different set of skills, different perspectives, different opinions, different values. They see the world a little differently. And when you can bring those differences together to work well and efficiently, everyone wins, which is why the acculturation aspect becomes so important. Now, there are certain pitfalls that we get into, such as ethnocentrism. And what I mean by ethnocentrism is basically looking into those differences and judging them from our own set of values. And not only judging, but deeming them wrong. That's not how we do things. It's just wrong. Well, switching our language from wrong to, wait, it's different. Is there value in this? Or my way is different. Let me show you what it is. Maybe that can add value. That changes perspective of everyone. That's how actually we can enrich, again, whether it's an organization or a nation. Stereotyping, overgeneralizing, looking at differences and not making the differentiation between individual differences versus this is how people are. That's overgeneralizing, that's stereotyping. Once again, you're building blocks and you're not actually acculturating, you're not actually trying to learn anything new in that sense. So instead of this, is it right, is it wrong, maybe looking at it as, okay, my way is a right way, but it's a right way instead of the right way. Is there a different right way? And can we actually learn from one another? That's the way to go. Now, when I was thinking about preparing for this talk and everything, I was thinking of all the differences that I have encountered, being an international scholar, being an, first of all, international student and an international scholar, a new minted US citizen, which means I am an immigrant. So in different contexts within the US, I was the other, I was the foreigner, and in many ways I still am. So what are some of the differences that I encountered? I was trying to come up with or narrow down the examples. And I realized that there are so many examples that are not just, okay, here are the differences I encountered because I'm from Turkey, but so many differences that I encountered living in different parts of United States. So starts with greetings. And those of you who have been in my class heard this example before. Greetings. For example, I was in the Midwest as a master's student, and a friendly way of greeting people is giving them a bear hug. Then I was a doctoral student in the Southwest, Phoenix, Arizona, and you either shake hands or you don't touch each other. Just a friendly hello is enough, not a lot of contact. Then I moved to Southeast, to Miami, South Florida, where the culture is completely different than anything I had encountered in the US up until that moment. And meet people, even in very formal settings, in your business setting, person you may meet even for the first time, and they may lean in and give you a kiss on the cheek. And if you're not used to it, you actually jump. Literally, I did that. I see that our dean is here, Dean Nisley. So I'm going to compare him to the previous dean I worked with. Yeah, the first time the dean kissed me on the cheek, I was like, what just happened? I'm so confused. And then you stop and you observe and you realize, yes, that's the way it goes. Hello, Dean Nisley. Thank you for not making me jump when I first met you. But these differences, these differences, this is within the same national context, US. So there's no such thing as this is how things work in the United States, different parts of United States. And from one organization to the other, how things are done at FIT, that's going to be different than how things are done mile away at NYU. There is a different culture. So observing, asking questions, learning, and being open to those differences, actually enriching who you are, how you do things, is the way to go. I do have a zillion other examples, but I do not want to run out of time. So I'm going to turn over to Eva, and perhaps through the Q&A we can get back to the other examples that I have.
Thank you. And your example was really interesting. I grew up abroad in South America. I was born in Suriname and I grew up in Brazil. So I was 9 when I returned to the Netherlands, and everybody sort of welcomed me as you're one of us. Yet I felt like a foreigner. I was very unfamiliar with Dutch culture, and the assumption was because I spoke Dutch, I just spoke it. I wasn't really able to read and write it very well. I had missed all of the stories, the TV, the foods, because I grew up in another country, and everybody made these assumptions about me understanding that, that we would understand and fit in, blend in seamlessly in Dutch culture. And it was quite difficult for us. Just the climate alone, we felt it was so cold. It took us a year to get accustomed to just the climate. So it's quite interesting when people look at you and they make these, well, you're Dutch, you're one of us, and you don't feel like one of them. So what makes you feel like the in group or the out group, right? You also made this interesting comment, how people see the world. And Nin, she said, and I use this quote with my students, we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. And then a sort of a variation of that is we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. But to understand how we see the world, we need not just to be aware of difference, we need to also be aware of our own perceptions or filters, and this is easier said than done. If we're not aware of culture, if we're not aware of the wind around us, then we might miss all kinds of things that are right in front of us, or we might see things and assume, like people would assume that I knew about Dutch culture because I looked Dutch and because my name was Dutch, and then so they were seeing things that weren't there. So I wanted to do a little exercise with you that I do with my students. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to use the chat. This is called a chat storm. So I'm going to show an image, ask you a question, and I ask you to write in the chat, but not hit enter until I say so that we see all of the answers at the same time. The reason I do that is because if we start reading other people's contributions, it influences what we are actually looking at, okay? So write, but do not hit enter, or whatever you do to complete, to send out the chat. Let me share the image. My question is very simple. What do you see? Write down 5 things that you see, the chat, but do not hit enter. So try to write 5 things that you see. Excellent. And so I would invite you to take a look at what people are writing. People on the phone, everyone is distracted, 4 men, 1 woman, a table, people with different postures, paper, boring meeting, 5 people, 4 pieces of paper, 2 talking, 1 sleeping, 1 praying, a man on the phone. Group seems pensive, but 1 is offering food, question mark. They're having a meeting, discussing some projects, boredom. Different levels of attention, 5 Turks trying to fix the country, a meeting with 1 woman, 5 people at a table, phone, depression, 1 woman, sleep. I don't know if there's a common between 1 woman and sleep, but so it's interesting. We're all looking at the same image, and yet we're seeing different things. So I'm going to share my screen one more time. So this activity is called Describe, Interpret, and Evaluate. So description is, and what I asked you is, what do you see? Right? So that would be a description. An interpretation is what you think about what you're seeing. And an evaluation is what you feel about what you're seeing. So now looking at that chat, and I would like for you to unmute and share. Do you see something, or maybe you can analyze your own contribution? Where would it fit? Would it be descriptive? What is it? Was it interpretative, or was it maybe evaluative or judgmental? And judgmental sounds very negative. I don't mean it that way. But was there an emotion connected to it? For example, boredom, to me, is a feeling about what we're seeing because it looked boring. You felt bored by looking at it. So is there anybody that would like to analyze their contribution and say, yeah, I wrote this and I feel now that it might be, or I was, this was a description, or mine was an interpretation.
I can
ahead.
go.
Yes.
So what I put in the chat, I believe, was very descriptive. I had thoughts as I was looking at it, definitely interpreting what I saw, evaluating what I saw, like how I felt about it. But I tried to keep what I put in the chat very descriptive. So I put like a table, I put paper, I said 5 people with different postures because you could see that. So I think everything happened at once when I looked at the image, but I tried to be very descriptive about it.
Very neutral and descriptive. Thank you. And is there somebody that went through the thought process but did not go back to the description but wrote the first thing that came up that was maybe an interpretation or an evaluation? Anybody want to share?
I think that this is Jean. I think that I did all 3 simultaneously.
Could you read out what you wrote?
Different levels of attention, levels of agency and power, different styles of communication and disengagement.
Yeah, so the disengagement and empowerment, I think that's all feeling. It's between interpretation and feeling, maybe. I don't really hear a description.
Yeah, I think you're right. I just went right to 2 and 3.
You went into the story, right? Because that's what we do. We go into a story when we see things. And this is an image. It could as easily be a situation in the streets, or we interpret things that are said to us. We interpret everything around us, right? So now the thing is, interpretation is always influenced by our own cultural perspectives. So the more we know about the world, or the more trained or skilled we are in intercultural competence and sort of distinguishing these 3 things, the easier it is maybe to describe. But interpretation is always colored by, or might I say limited by, our perspective of the world. We're like these horses with the blinders on, right? There's things that we just don't see. We can miss things that are right in front of us, or we might see things that aren't really there. So that's the interesting thing about engaging with different cultures, but also the challenging thing about. So diversity, what Nurhayat spoke about, is offering us a possibility to see things differently, yet at the same time, this is very uncomfortable because we go into this narrative that is sometimes different or sometimes contradicts what we believe in our core, right? To be right or wrong, clean or dirty, efficient, inefficient. So this is a sort of the challenge and the dilemma that we find ourselves in. So for me, developing intercultural competence is really about self-awareness first and foremost. Because when my students come into my classroom, like, okay, so teach me about all the cultures in the world. So do you have a minute? Because I don't even know about all the cultures in the world. What I do know is about myself. So understanding yourself first, and seeing the different levels of the diversity even within you and how you see the world, and starting to see more things, seeing more details. Even just in Amsterdam, which is a very diverse city, maybe not as much as New York, but definitely somewhere in the same vicinity when it comes to diversity. Just starting to discover this and being able to see it without judging. So postponing judgment about it, but just observing it and training yourself in asking questions that are descriptive as instead of interpretative questions. So there's one thing that I teach my students. I have this saying, and I didn't invent it myself, so this is from somewhere else. You have 2 eyes, you have 2 ears, you have but 1 mouth. Use them accordingly. And it really does help. Dutch people are very direct, very outspoken, borderline rude. For us, this directness is the core value there is honesty and transparency, and equality. That's why but it comes across as very impolite, and I apologize for my people in general. But learning to withhold that immediate comment, and observing and listening are really excellent skills to develop. I wanted to stop here and maybe open for questions or reactions. Over to you, Nurhayat.
Thank you so much. Well, let me start by asking a question. Maybe that will get us started. When you think about differences, cultural differences, whether it's in an organization, business setting, or outside, what are some of the things that come to mind? For example, let's start with this. You have a meeting. What does it mean to be late for a meeting?
For me, it means it's rude.
So if the meeting starts at 9 o'clock, when would you consider it being rude? Like what time, if someone arrives at, say, 9:05 or 9:10, 9:20?
9:20 is definitely rude. 9:05 is about my limit. For me, it's disrespectful.
It's disrespectful, and the first
Yeah.
5 minutes, there might be allowances, but that's about it.
Yeah, for me. But I'm a little type A about time.
Now, I was going to turn to Alex, and this is where I'm doing what I tell you not to do, stereotyping. But I was going to turn to our resident German to answer that question.
It is stereotyping, yes, but it's okay.
I have to clarify, I have an aunt who is German, my uncle's wife. So I'm basing a lot of stereotyping on her. And again, this is what I teach not to do. So personal disclaimer right there. Eva, what would you consider late?
Personally, or Dutch people?
Dutch people.
Okay, Dutch people.
A general norm.
Yeah, so they are very punctual. When trains arrive late at the station, so if they're between 3 to 5 minutes late, we need to see a warning, because otherwise people get very upset. That's absurd to me. So I think there's in academia, in universities, there's these 15 minutes allowance, but in business, no. You need to be early. So if you want to chit chat, you do that before. So you have your coffee, you sit down, and you're ready to start on the dot. Yeah.
Yes, and that goes for many Western European contexts. The general norm is if you have a meeting at 9, you get there 5-10 minutes early. You want to chit chat, you have something other than the meeting's topic to talk about, you do that beforehand. 9 o'clock is, there's no hi, hello, how are you? You open and you start. In the US, well, where in the US? Because again, depending on where you are, 5 minutes, maybe there's a little bit of an allowance in different contexts, but yes, you start. Now, when you start, it usually does take a few minutes to get into the business topic in terms of there are certain pleasantries, there are certain small talk. Hope everyone got here okay, or was it easy to find the place, whatever it is. If you're in Miami, you arrive between 9 and 9:15, and then there's at least a 5 to 10 minutes chit chat, small talk, get your coffee. So if the 9 o'clock meeting starts at 9:25, you're lucky. That's on time, even within the same country. So what are certain things that come to your mind when you think about these differences? Anyone can offer any examples? Yeah.
I think that it's not just about the time, it's about the practice. And so when you make an agenda for a meeting, or you just indicate what the meeting is about, that's also the time when you let people know when you plan to really start the meeting. So if somebody says we're going to have coffee in Danish beforehand, then you have that buffer zone. But let's use the classroom as an example I'll use myself as an example. I tell my students that I expect them to be on time and to notify me if they expect to be delayed. I have made exceptions when I teach in buildings where the elevators are terrible, where I just unilaterally start the class at 10 after because it's not realistic to expect them. But I will say this, I tell them that the same thing I used to tell employees is the start time is the time that you have already hung up your coat and sat down in the seat ready to go. The start time is not the time you walk in the door. And so with my students, unless they notify me they're going to be late, they are expected to apologize to everybody in the class for the disruption, starting at about 5 minutes after. Because the issue is not really whether or not they abide by the time, it's whether or not they respect everybody in the room who has come to work. And so in a classroom, I do that. Now, on the other hand, family events, it's like, forget about it. If you insist on
Yeah,
the time,
that's
so
that's a
that's one.
great
That's
point.
my
It's also contextual and situational, most definitely. Eva.
Yeah, I wanted to add. So my Dutch students can get very upset when they feel that their time is not being respected. So we talk about that because that feeling is based on what they feel, that if you don't respect time, you don't respect me, because task is more important than relationship. So when we work with cultures, even within our classrooms, we sometimes have very diverse cultures represented, but especially when we work internationally, we talk about how you can focus on the relationship. So we wait until everybody is here and we start when everybody is comfortable, or we focus on the task, the deadline. There's something we need to do. And there's no right or wrong. There's just a sort of a preference that we're taught from early on. And the thing is to find out what some of these norms are, because often they are unwritten. Like, you were very specific about what the rules were, but very often we're not. And we make these assumptions that people will know what the rules are, but how do we find out? And how do we find out what people's emotions are behind, those rules, underlying those rules? So if we disconnect how it makes us feel from just observing what is actually going on and seeing that there's different ways to approach it, sometimes can take a little bit of the sting out of it, and we can start to be acculturalize. You called it, right? Nurhayat, would we meet in the middle?
Acculturate.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. These things are not written down, and they do influence one another. Jeffrey, can you mute, please?
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. For example, when it comes to time, it's not just time in terms of when does the meeting start. If we're talking about people who are used to a norm, when even delay of a minute or two is perceived as this is disrespectful because it's being disrespectful to my time, equates being disrespectful to me. Now, put that in the context of, for instance, in cultural contexts where there's a larger power distance when it comes to hierarchy in an organization, where, for example, in China, the general norm is there's a higher or a stronger power distance, meaning supervisor has the word. If you have a supervisor, you should not be answering any questions that come to you. You should go and check and get the official answer and then reply. So think of two companies doing business between, say, US, where there's a much lower, much more horizontal power distance, compared to China. You're doing business. Someone asks a question to their counterpart in China. Now, if they were to receive that question, they would answer right away. Within 5 minutes, there's the answer. I saw the email. I know the answer. I sent the answer. In China, that's not what you do. Again, general norm. Do not stereotype. General norm. You go, you check your answer. Even if you know the answer, you get the official backup, official word, send it back. What happened there? Time passed. Sometimes 24 hours, maybe even longer. So if you're in the US, you may look at it as they're not even giving me the simplest answer. They're lazy. They're disrespecting my time. They're just not doing the work that needs to be done, as efficiently at least. Whereas on the other hand, that fast answer you sent to China, now they're questioning your competency. Wait a minute, they just gave me the first thought that came to their minds. They did not check the answer. They did not make sure how am I going to trust the answer that I received, even though I received it really fast? So it's not just a matter of, okay, here meetings start at 9. That means I need to be there at 5 to 9 so that we start at 9. But there's a larger value, there's a larger norm, way of seeing the world that's attached to it, which presents itself in different contexts.
And if I may add to that, I work currently with some universities in South Africa, and then there's yet a new aspect to that. Ubuntu as a philosophy, it says "I am because we are," and especially with the history in South Africa, where with apartheid, what my country was partly responsible for. At least we were one of the colonizing countries. So the project revolves around decolonizing the curriculum. And everything we do needs to be very inclusive. And in South Africa, diversity, but also inclusion means something different than it does in the Dutch context. So this answer, for example, that you would seek, they're seeking consensus, but not necessarily because, because they want everybody to be able to chime in, but because all voices need to be heard, because not all voices were heard for so long, right? So there's this underlayer, but then whose voice? So for me as an outsider, it's sometimes not clear how long I should wait for an answer, whether the answer is trustworthy, because some people were not heard and I did not know about it. So these complexities all come into play. So politics and history can influence culture. Culture is not something that changes very quickly, but it is dynamic. It is not static. But it is interesting, especially when we work, globally, when we put people with all of these different backgrounds and ideas about what inclusion and diversity is into the room, how to manage that, especially, what is the dominant setting? If we're in the US, what is considered efficient and when do we decide to move forward, right? Without hurting feelings. So these are complex questions, and there's not a simple answer to that. But these are things that we do need to take into account as we're encountering each other more and more, and in this online sphere even more. So I don't know about your experiences in working internationally, whether you have found that diversity is actually inducive to innovation or it's actually pretty challenging.
I'm going to go with both. Do we have any questions?
Maybe something that surprised. Yes, go ahead.
I can go. So, okay, this whole discussion that we had was very interesting, and I feel like we've spoken about this before, at least in your class, Professor. But here's the thing. So when all of these different, when you are working within different cultures and with people from different parts of the world, how do you reach a happy medium? Let's take time, for example. How do you reach that happy medium, or how do you kind of bridge the gap, the different cultural gap that you have with these different norms?
How do you find that happy medium? Well, first and foremost, you let go of your own assumptions, or like I said, looking at it as this is the right way. You realize that your right way may not be everyone else's. It is still a right way, but it's not the right way. So making allowances and understanding that people may have different habits out of different perspectives, and your interpretation of it may not be correct. Just like the picture that Eva showed us. So when something is late, am I jumping to conclusions saying this person or this group, they are not respecting me? Or am I saying, wait a minute, is there something else going on? Keeping that open mind and making allowances for differences to exist. And then you can even take it a step further and look at it as, okay, is there value in this that I can take, that I can learn? Maybe I can certainly change the way I do things, at least in different contexts. If you're Dutch, no, you're not going to start using time differently if you know you're in a group of people who do have those norms. But maybe in different contexts, you can start changing, and maybe you can start seeing, hey, there's value in this as well. Renee, I'm sorry, you have a hand up.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to address that question and make a few additional comments since we're talking about time. I'm currently teaching graduate students from around the world. I have students in Asia who are in Shanghai and Singapore, and there's a difference there culturally. I have students in the U.S. Who are in New York, South Carolina, and California. Major differences, as the professor has pointed out. And I have students in Canada, all in one class. Because they're graduate students, my expectation was, and this is not their first semester, that, when class starts on time. Not the case. So I find that as I'm working around the world, communication is key. Not just verbal, not just in writing, but speaking. See, so when I start my classes now, I do tend to start later than at the scheduled time because out of respect for the students in Asia who are up in the middle of the night, who are always on time, versus the students in California who have to get up early in the morning. So I try with communication, and as I start out the semester, I allow maybe 5 or more minutes before I start class. But as we're moving through the semester, I get closer and closer to starting at that East Coast time that we're all supposed to start at. So I think communication and how we communicate to everyone is important, not just in writing, but explaining at the beginning of class and at the end of the class, because as Jeffrey pointed out, it is about respect for everyone in the room.
Eva,
Yeah.
please bring us together. It's 1 o'clock anyway.
Yeah, no, just to jump on what Renee was saying, communication is key, but I think also in that, to understand that people communicate in different manners. Not everybody may communicate the way you expected, like clearly and directly. They may have a roundabout way of saying it. They might hint at it. They might tell somebody else. Erin Meyer wrote this book, The Culture Map, and the chapter about communication has, for me, the best title ever, Listening to the Air. I think to develop these intercultural competence, one of the things is that we need to start being more aware and being more agile in how we communicate, and especially also how we receive messages, how we decode messages, because sometimes people are telling us something very clearly, but just not in a way that we always understand. So I really appreciated that comment, Renee. Thank you. And thank you for having me here. This was so much fun.
Thank you so much, Eva and Nurhayat. Does anyone have any final thoughts to relate or final questions?
I'd like to see us take a more process-oriented approach towards this discussion in future events. And by that, I mean recognizing that there's issues of inclusivity, respect, diversity, and so on. I think we need to set more of a process-oriented way of saying we get better at this over time, but we don't just by intellectually recognizing the issue perform at that level. Because I think there's an expectation that, just like students think if they study something, they know how to do it. And meanwhile, you've been trying to do it your whole life, right? And you're getting better and better, but it's a process. And I just feel that sometimes students and also colleagues are reacting to almost like an insult if there's an unintended microaggression or a use of verbiage or a cultural reference that, the way Nurhayat very carefully couched, some of the observations she made. I personally don't object to that, but I always like it to be in a conscious way and that we all treat ourselves like we're works in progress. And I just think that it's a little bit too binary, for my taste, the way a lot of this goes on. Who could argue with that?
It is certainly not binary. It's, the whole idea of, for instance, acculturation is simply that. It's not that you start somewhere, you end up somewhere, it comes in waves. First of all, your adaptation, your acculturation. Second, you realize that you keep changing, and sometimes changing back into norms you're used to, sometimes, and it is contextual, situational. It's even relational in terms of people that you are interacting with. It is going to change who you are. I love the Ubuntu. See, I learned something new.
Yeah, Ubuntu. It's really beautiful. I am because we are. Yeah, I learned that too, and we use, for example, I've used Ubuntu to explain the concept to students when we were having these difficult, challenging conversations around Black Pete. It's a celebration in the Netherlands. Saint Nicholas is our Santa Claus. And the way in the old days, some people still want to celebrate it, which is very offensive and hurtful to some. So when we have conversations with our students, well, the Ubuntu way to look at this is, if it hurts one, we should all care. It hurts us all. Nobody should be hurt or felt left out. It's challenging, but it's a way to think about it. I also really agree with the former speaker. It's a practice. And a practice like yoga, it's different every time, but you need to consciously do it, and it needs to. I think you need to connect it to important aspects. So, is it part of your curriculum in a way? So does it appear in different ways? It shouldn't just be the responsibility of the diversity officer. It should be something that everybody does and is engaged with in some way. But it's definitely a mindfulness practice, and I don't mean that in a yoga way, but a constantly being conscious of and accepting that every new situation you need to sort of start over and learn again. Yeah. And Renee, I wanted to write for you in the chat another book that I really wanted to recommend.
Yeah. So glad you could join us, Renee, too. Okay, well, I think that we're all going to walk away having learned so much. And thank you very much for all of your insight and great conversation. Let's have more of these. Really appreciate it. Thanks for beaming in from the Netherlands, Eva.
You're welcome. Dinner time now.
Thank you. I know. Enjoy your dinner. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you, Eva, for doing this.
No,
thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. This was a lot of fun. Always nice to have a project. We need to think of more projects to do together.
Yes, please.
Sounds good. Please. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.